Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Andy Herskowitz, the Executive Director for ODI, that used to be known as the Overseas Development Institute. ODI is a UK-based think tank, existed since the 1960s. It's a global affairs and development think tank. And I'm the Executive Director here in Washington, D.C., a recently opened up office. We're looking forward to working with many of you as we expand our reach and influence throughout the region and throughout the world. I'm very excited about this particular panel because we're joined by a distinguished group of panelists to discuss how we're going to mobilize climate financing in conflict-affected countries. Countries that really are some of the most vulnerable in the world for a variety of reasons. They already struggle to attract capital of any type, but when they try to attract climate finance, it's a subset that makes it even more and more difficult. When we look at what the priorities often are of the global north countries, they're often focused heavily on mitigation, but what the countries of the global south really need is adaptation money as well. How to make sure that the roads that are being built, which already don't exist, that when they are built, they're not going to crumble, that the hospitals that are going to be built are going to be able to withstand heat fluctuations, and equipment can withstand those things. So really, it's adaptation finance that we need to focus on. And currently, the conflict-affected countries and the fragile countries are only capturing a tiny fraction of already the small amount of climate donor money that's available. In 2020, they received $4.68 per capita from climate donors versus $7.19 for other low-income countries. And low-income countries still haven't received enough. Those involved in high-intensity conflict, for obvious reasons, receive less. And what determines what they receive is tied more to their ability to absorb funding, which makes it challenging for countries that are involved in high-intensity conflict than what their actual need and vulnerability is to climate change. But it's clear that the most vulnerable are struggling to attract funding. Yesterday, I released a blog, it's on LinkedIn if you want to look it up, that we took a look at what are some of the things that can be done to attract financing in fragile contexts, fragile areas, things like placing people on the ground, having dedicated units of people within the MDBs and the DFIs whose job is to focus on work in these regions so they don't get distracted and working on other things, working through intermediaries who are on the ground, working together, recognizing that not everybody can have people on the ground, and then also making sure that you're providing low-cost, heavily blended financing to make these deals work. There's been attention and modest acceleration of interest in this area of accelerating financing. At COP28, you had the Declaration on Climate Relief, Recovery, and Peace, which raised awareness on this blind spot. But more action is needed, and I think we all know that, and that's why we're all here. This session is going to explore the barriers and the opportunities. I hope we get into specifics and not generalities. We have great people on this panel. We've got funders, intermediaries, recipients, and we're going to look at the best practices, novel partnerships, and other opportunities. So we're delighted to be joined by this distinguished group of panelists. I'm going to have a seat now, and we'll go ahead and start the discussion. So our first panelist is His Excellency Salah Ahmed Jammeh, who's the Deputy Prime Minister of the Federal Republic of Somalia. He previously served as a Minister of Labor and the Minister of Constitutional Affairs. Prior to working in government, His Excellency has worked on a range of issues, from development and youth employment to democratization policy. Your Excellency, welcome. The government of Somalia recently estimated that its climate finance needs were $5.5 billion per year. Yet according to the Climate Policy Initiative, Somalia only received $320 million in climate finance between 2019 and 2020. This amounts to less than 6% of what's required. What does this shortfall in climate finance mean for the trajectory of Somalia in terms of climate resilience and development? And what is the government of Somalia doing to scale up its capacity to access and disperse climate finance?
I guess I can be heard. Well, thank you very much, and I would like to appreciate the opportunity for us to bring to the attention to various actors the challenge we face in terms of climate adaptation to climate change. I think mitigation is something of secondary priority for countries recovering from fragility and conflict, and countries that are in the front line of climate change impact, and countries that hardly contribute to green gas emissions. Somalia is one of the most expensive places to produce energy, yet we have the highest potential for solar and wind energy. But we do not explore those options, for we don't have the resources. But let me give you the context of what this shortage in terms of climate financing means for the Somali government. As a country that has recovered from prolonged civil war, that is about to defeat Al-Shabaab, that has just a couple of months ago finally reached the completion point of the debt relief HIPC agenda, that is currently, as we speak, writing or putting in place its 10th National Development Plan, that's also aiming at bringing about transformational change in our productive sector. The unavailability of climate financing is a major impediment to our development planning. Why do I say this? In an era of very limited fiscal space, the choice that our Minister of Finance and the government has to make in terms of resource allocation is whether to continue investing in the war against Al-Shabaab and pay the stipends and the salaries of soldiers and civil servants, whether we invest in productive sector, or whether we have to allocate resources for the recurring humanitarian crisis that is happening one after the other, either in the form of floods or in the form of droughts. Unprecedented and unaccounted for in the normal planning process. As we speak, the current estimate for humanitarian response in Somalia is $1.6 billion, as we speak. The USAID alone spent $1 billion last year in humanitarian response. And these are the citizens that are coming from the most fertile and productive parts of the country. I have used this example in various forums, but a Somali nomad or subsistence farmer that either has 300 goats and sheep at their disposal, or a farm that is enough for them and their community, would find themselves poor and destitute overnight. And then well before they recover from the first shock, the second one comes in. So luckily we have programs such as Bahnano, developing collaboration with the World Bank, that establishes national social safety nets in place. But the resourcing of those programs now comes from in the form of grants and aid elsewhere. So for us to factor this in, we must be able to compensate. So I want to connect this to the Lost and Damaged Fund, the elusive fund that is yet to reach us. The Lost and Damaged Fund, the Green Climate Fund. Luckily, I think as we speak, the head of the GEF is in Somalia, or will be in Somalia, which is a positive development. It is a product of many years of advocacy and bringing our issue to the table. How do we factor in the loss that is occurring to the household, the community, infrastructure? In the last floods, about 15 bridges or flyovers that were built by the last government, that were the lifeline infrastructure for communities in southern Somalia, have all been destroyed. These are infrastructure that survived many years of other destructive tendencies. How do we factor that in? Fixing that would cost billions of dollars, millions of dollars, and we don't have the resource for it. We are yet to increase our revenue base. Volatility in global markets also affects us. So as I was at Sharm el-Sheikh not that long ago, I was at the COP28, the last one in Dubai. I think it's about time to come up with a very specific and tailored approach towards fragile and conflict-prone countries. In this trade-offs discourse, we don't have the luxury of coping with climate change impact and also trying to get our institutions going on a regular basis. So we don't have the connection between moving from humanitarian crisis to stabilization to development. And I would, as I argued yesterday, we would really appreciate if climate change finance can bridge that gap of vulnerability, that gap of fiscal deficit, that gap of developmental aspirations of our people. If we were, for instance, to invest in water, which is a major problem in Somalia, it will require billions of dollars. And we didn't have rain for the last 3-4 seasons in a row. That costs us a lot. If we convert that, we will probably be eligible for billions of dollars under the damage and loss fund if it ever works. But somehow the world is preoccupied in moving away from carbon-based production of energy, shutting down, a coal-producing factory somewhere in one of those energy-producing countries. And we are forgetting about those people in the front lines who are losing life. So for us as Somalis, climate change impact is not about something of the distant future. It is about realities of life and death as we speak. We would like to factor in a predictable, sustainable, and accessible climate finance in our national planning processes so that we move away from this vicious recurring cycle to a more manageable. I mean, we must admit that the crises have become the new norm. So we can't shut our eyes and say, oh, maybe next year we'll get rain. The science tells us that we will be in this situation for a while. And I think adaptation should be given more priority in countries like Somalia, like some of the Sahel countries, the Horn of Africa, where livestock and people are equally vulnerable to the impact of climate change. $300 million is way too short of $5 billion. And in terms of justice, climate justice, the Paris agreements, it is about time that we address these issues practically. And it's a global challenge. It's not a Somali problem only, because it translates into human migration. A lot of our youth are risking their lives in the Mediterranean Sea and trying to make it to Europe and America. And I think the more we find local solutions, the better off the rest of the world would be. Sorry, I spoke for a bit.
No, it was great, because what I'm hearing is that everyone talks about financing mitigation and adaptation, and most people in the world couldn't tell you what the difference between mitigation and adaptation were. They're technical terms to the average person. But really, the mitigation part is reducing the emissions, and the adaptation is what we view as traditional development. And so one of the complaints that you're hearing from people is that the climate agenda is coming at the expense of traditional development, but the same people are saying we need to increase adaptation financing. We need to bring that together, because you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the bridges, it's the agriculture, all the things that traditional development has done, and that's what adaptation really is. So thanks for those insights. I really appreciated that. Our next panelist is Her Excellency Kenya Barley, who's the Minister of Planning and Economic Development of the Republic of Sierra Leone. She's also the current chair of the G7+, an intergovernmental organization of conflict-affected countries working on peace, stability, and development. Your Excellency, the G7+ group represents 20 member states affected by the challenges of conflict and fragility. What do you see as the collective priorities of the G7+ group to ensure members have access to the financing needed to support climate action?
Thank you. Okay. I was hoping it didn't eat into my time, but thank you, Andrew, for that question. And as you did mention, I also represent the G7+ here. That is a group of 20 countries affected by the challenges of climate and fragility. And we do acknowledge that climate and vulnerability are an issue of fragility. And this is why, with the support of our partners, we did organize a side event at COP28 UAE. and we fully endorse the declaration. There are a number of recommendations in the declaration that border on climate finance, but there are 3 areas that I want to emphasize because of the time. And the 3 areas are all areas that do impact and affect our fragile countries. And the first is for partners to increasingly invest in the use of government-led platforms. Sometimes the importance of this is underscored. And I think if we do invest, if partners do invest, then we're fully able to maximize the investments. And as called for in the declaration, it emphasizes the need for the complementarity of mandates between organizations, the sharing of information, and supporting operational partnerships, as well as improving access to financing and achieving these priorities. And also the challenges that affect the distribution of these finances. And these challenges relate to the fragmentation of aid. We have so many donors, so many interested groups, but this aid is not consolidated. Now, if we use the national platforms to coordinate these aids, then we're more likely to make greater impact. And these platforms, especially platforms in Sierra Leone, or the one platform that we have for development partnership in Sierra Leone, has led to policy dialogue, has led for us jointly identifying priorities along the lines of resilience or other issues. And what we want to do as a G7 Plus partnership, that in countries where this has worked, in countries where we've been able to prioritize with donors, we want to also replicate this in other countries that do not have these platforms, because we think that this is the way forward. The second area, which is very important, is and related, but is the need to harmonize procedures and processes for accessing climate finance. We observe that there's an absence of guiding and common frameworks for resilience among major partners. And this, if we had this partnership, guided resilience, then we feel that we could better target resources as well. Investments in fragile settings is an issue that needs to be addressed by numerous actors, and climate financing needs to be brought together. We're looking at the complementarities, establish better tailoring of assistance in country context, including carrying out risk and vulnerability mapping at all levels to understand and address these risks. We also need a common framework for strengthening resilient capabilities and a combined approach for resilience building and climate action. And the G7 Plus sees this as being vital to move from risk mapping to analysis and common tailored action. So this is the second area that we feel is, and lastly, but not least, the declaration calls for, and I quote, enhancing predictability, flexibility, disbursement speed and simplicity, and working to reduce transaction costs. This, we feel, our members feel, is another area of importance and priority, because it's been difficult to know what funds exist, for countries to know what funds exist, how to access them, and how to comply with the myriad of requirements with the low capacities of some of the countries. So we are thankful that there are organizations that recognize this as a problem and have shown their commitment to work with our countries to simplify processes and procedures to access them, to access the vital funding needed to support. So the central theme of my intervention is consolidated and combined support to government-led initiatives to unlock climate finance. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are really interesting interventions. I just want to share a little bit and reflect on that a little bit, because for years, we've been saying we need more harmonized procedures, and we struggle to do it. No government wants to use anybody else's, or no institution wants to use anybody else's procedures, but we have seen some success. We've seen some success during COVID when some institutions said, you know what, fine, we'll use the IFC's procedures, we'll use others. And so it's a little bit of governments needing or institutions to surrender their egos a little bit and realize it's really not that much different in making that work. The other point that I would make is, what I've seen is that donors, and this goes to the country platform issue and coordinating, they often will pile on to success. So even if the procedures of different entities are not harmonized, once a particular borrower or entity figures out how to crack the nut of accessing funding from a particular donor, the other donors become attracted to it. So it does become a little bit easier. But I 100% agree with you that you have to do greater harmonization, figuring out how to work together. So thank you for those really thoughtful interventions. Our next panelist is Ousmane Diagana, who's the Regional Vice President for Western and Central Africa at the World Bank. He's worked at the World Bank for over 20 years. Prior to his current post, he served as Vice President of Human Resources and Vice President for Ethics and Business Conducts. If you were the Vice President of Human Resources, you're the person who needs to figure out how to make simplified procedures then, so that's great. And has held assignments as a country director for the bank in multiple African countries. Mr. Diagana, many countries across West and Central Africa face mounting pressure from overlapping threats related to climate, conflict, and fragility. As the world's largest provider of climate finance, can you share examples of the sorts of activities that the World Bank is supporting to strengthen access to climate finance amongst fragile and conflict-affected countries across the region? And I'm going to add to that, let's be specific. What are we doing differently? You've been in the bank for 20 years. What have you seen that's worked? If you could, wave a magic wand and say, I wish we could do things this way, what would that look like? And are you able to deliver on that?
Specific derive from general, so we have to be first general and then we can be specific. But I really would like to say how delighted I am to be in this panel and to have on my right policy makers, our client and our raison d'etre as a development institution, and my left consumer development partners. I think partnership is a key in this agenda, especially in actually helping FCVs to address the very pressing development challenges that they face. Climate finance is a crucial. It's a crucial for all the country at this time of climate crisis, but it's particularly crucial for FCVs, and this is for three reasons. That's why I wanted to be first general. The first reason being that it provides funding to help countries adapt and, if relevant, mitigate obviously climate change effect. Second, it helps country communities and business to actually transition to climate resilient pathway. Resilient infrastructure, renewable energy, reforestation, restoration of land, etc., etc. And third, it helps actually countries also to address the disproportionate impact of climate change, especially on the most vulnerable. So that's why for us, development institutions like the World Bank, climate finance is at the center of all what we are doing. Before giving some specific on what we are doing, in particular in Africa, with a focus on West and Central Africa, I would like, however, to highlight the issues that the FCVs face to have access to this fundamental financing instrument. The first issue, of course, related to the lack of capacity, institutional capacities, and second, their capability also to build strong bankable portfolio of project. And the third issue is the process, which is cumbersome, lengthy, and make it very, very difficult for countries, especially FCVs, to have access to resources. And the World Bank, therefore, as last resort financing partner, consider crucial to provide resources to countries in order to indeed address the issues that we have mentioned. And we do so in all the countries. We're zooming really on FCVs. In a country like Nigeria, we have, as we speak, more than $800 million of projects that essentially address, help countries actually to face the climate change. In Sahel, through different programs on water resources, irrigation, pastoralism, agriculture, or providing support to private sector actor, we do have a very, very large portfolio. In Central African Republic, we have an $80 million of renewable project that actually has helped the country to increase by more than 2/3, actually, the access to energy, in particular in Bangui, where most of the business, especially small and medium enterprises, are located, but also beyond Bangui in some other areas that are exposed to fragility and to conflict. We are also utilizing this finance to support the agenda of prevention. In the Gulf of Guinea region in West and Central Africa, we are providing programs that help build social cohesion, job creation through, in particular, economic transformation initiative, meaning how we can help young groups and women actually to have access to digital, program that can create jobs, etc., etc. So it's really at the center of what we are doing, and we have been very deliberate on this agenda. Last year, 35% of our climate of our resources were dedicated to climate finance. So for a region like West Africa, West and Central Africa, where we do annually an average of $12 billion, meaning 35% of those 12 billion was essentially oriented toward programs that help countries to be more resilient to climate shock, to support smart agriculture program, and to build on some of the innovation carried by youth in particular, to how we can actually bring those to scale, so that actually they will contribute also to increasing income generation activities, which is also fundamental in the context of West and Central Africa for peace and stability. So capitalizing on the result from those programs, this year we have decided actually to increase the share of climate finance in our overall program, to bring this to 45% of our financial resources. And in this 45%, we would like to make sure that minimum of the 45% of climate finance go to adaptation. As you said, this is actually what is really meant, and this is crucial for FCVs in particular. So there are a number of programs certainly that we can share. Existing portfolio, but new initiative that is underway. We just presented to our board a program specific for Senegal River, which is an area because of climate challenge. We are seeing a lot of human mobilities, and which is actually contributing to make this area more fragile. In the Liptako Gourma is part of this Sahel Central. We have an existing program, but given the crisis, we are trying to see how we can provide additional finance that will allow actually the three countries that make this space, meaning Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, ready to, through this type of initiative, provide just-in-time solution for people who have been particularly affected by conflict and by vulnerability, both being, of course, stemming from climate change to some aspect. I would conclude by saying that we are not only providing actually finance. We are engaged in countries through policy dialogue, through technical assistance, through analytics. There is a core analytical product that we are doing in all the country, but we say, once again, focusing on FCV, which we call a country climate and development report, because this allows us to be more granular on what are the issues and therefore what are the remedies that could be considered in helping the country to be more resilient. So let me so.
Thanks so much. I mean, one of the privileges of being the chair of a panel like this is I get to ask the questions and inject my thoughts on your comments. I'm going to do that for you, but what makes a panel way more interesting is when the panelists are commenting on one another's comments. So I'm going to, I know that people want to have questions from the floor, but I'm going to invite each of you also. I saw you writing something down, Salah, that was interesting that I'm sure is a commentary on what Usman was saying. So I want to invite you to comment on what they said. Usman, I loved what you said. I spent a significant part of my career trying to figure out how to accelerate investment in African infrastructure when I was running Power Africa. And one of the more, I don't say controversial pieces I wrote was the 7 deadly challenges of investing in African infrastructure, but it was really meant to highlight what can be done. And then I spent some time at DFC, at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, and I narrowed my 7 down to 3, and you touched on 2 of them. One is capacity. Either governments don't have enough people to work on the projects, or maybe they don't have the particular skill set, and that's a role that the donors and others and MDBs can play. But the other piece is something that the managing director of the bank brought up yesterday, and that we faced at DFC as well, and it has to do really with political will. So it's great for the bank and others to reduce their processing times and approval processes, and I understand the bank has made some significant progress already since the new president's been in place. But it's often the client, it's on the other side. And how long do the governments take to approve a project? If the bank does everything that it needs to do and it reduces it from 7 months to 3 months, it doesn't do us any good if the government side takes 2 years to do that. So everyone has to contribute. So that's the political will piece. So those are great points. Thank you. Our next intervention will be from Issa Faye, who's the Director General of Global Practice and Partnership at the Islamic Development Bank. Dr. Faye has worked for multilateral development banks for over 20 years, leading teams to deliver research, analytical, and evaluative work on issues including private sector innovation, impact investment, and more. So, Dr. Faye, the Islamic Development Bank plays a crucial role in supporting member countries to respond to the impacts of climate change, especially in settings affected by conflict and fragility. Can you share with us what you see as priorities for accelerating access to MDB financing to accelerate climate action in fragile and conflict-affected member countries? Again, a very general question. That's a softball. So let's be specific and feel free to tell us what everybody needs to be doing differently.
Thank you. I'll try my best, Andrew. But at the onset, I would like to thank the World Bank and then the FCV team for inviting us into this conversation. It is really an honor to be here today. But by way of introduction, I would just like to say that at the Islamic Development Bank, we are very concerned about the FCV situation. Because if you look at our membership, 31 countries out of the 57 are fragile. So we feel it in our balance sheet, we feel it in our portfolio, we feel it across everything that we do. So we must have a solution. And we're trying to really, Andrew, this is where I'm going to come to your questions. We have been pondering around this and then reflecting and trying to see how can we address this? How can we really make a dent? Where we're in the situation where, I mean, the countries are going crisis after crisis. I mean, I heard Mr. Minister of Somalia and Sierra Leone. It's a no-brainer. It's there. It's intricated. It comes from the economic crisis, downturns. You have debt issues, fiscal issues, and then combined with all the natural disasters, climate, and you name them. So, but when you reflect, it comes down to 2-3 things, I think, that we have to reflect and think about. One is we need to really to fix the plumbing. The financial system needs some fixing, the plumbing, because money needs to flow where it's abundant to where it's scarce. It's not really happening that way. The money is sitting somewhere. There is patient capital. There is long-term service industry, insurance, pension fund, sovereign wealth fund. They have a lot of money, and the money is patient. It's there to be leveraged. And we've not been able to flow that money into where it's most needed, which is a fragile complex. So the plumbing is not working. There is something that, and I think that's the first point of attack in this two-pronged approach. Goes through the route of the financial systems, and the second is what Usman has elaborated a little bit about institutional capacity building and making sure that the governance is there. So coming back from the first point into the financial systems, I think we need to be very innovative. I mean, multilateral development banks have been doing a lot and what they can. But there is a limitation, we all know it. Money is limited. And then our process is sometimes is not conducive to giving money quickly. And what we need in the FCVs is quick money and a large chunk of money and affordable money. How to make that happen in the financial system, where you have a system that is based on risk. When you go to bottom line practice, is that the system, the traditional system is based on risk. Your loan is priced based on the risk. Risk is inherent to fragile country states. How do you solve that conundrum? It's based on risk, your pricing is based on risk, and you need to flow the money. So you need to get out of that system. You need to think out of the box and see how you can really reduce the cost of borrowing, and on the other side, try to maybe tweak a little bit the structure of the financing in such a way that you have affordable money that comes on top of the traditional financing that you can get. The Islamic Development Bank has been trying. We've been putting money. We committed at COP20 that we're going to allocate $1 billion in the next 3 years to climate finance. We're already pushing our portfolio. 35% is climate finance, but it's not sufficient. We need to go into this de-risking the FCV situation in such a way that the private sector can come in and the philanthropists can come in. Ethical finance can come in. Those is the future in terms of financing. Multilateralism can make sure that the environment is conducive to bring those type of capital where it's most needed. So we have all those different guarantees, PRGs, political and insurance risk-based tools and systems, but they're limited. And the way that they price is that it's never cheap. So how do you go to that hurdle of risk and the FCVs are crowded out. They're crowded out of the system. So we need to now come with some kind of a measurement of how do we go around that circle and then make sure that we bring the affordable money. And I think that this is the route that we're taking in bringing grants more and more in the Islamic Development Bank. We're working with a lot of partners in the Arab Coordination Group to use grant to try to kind of provide seed capital to bring the hard money into the place. That's one way of doing that. We are also trying to build a new concessional window. We are working with you, ODI, and trying to push for concessional money to be like in our ordinary financing type. We're trying to do at the Islamic Development Bank. And we're also trying to do blended. We're trying to blend. We have what we call the Life and Livelihood Fund in the bank, which is kind of working with the Abu Dhabi fund, the Qatari fund, and the Bill and Melinda Gates funds to try to also make sure that we can blend some concessional with the ordinary financing that we have. So these are different things that we are doing. It's not perfect, and it needs to be more, we need more sophisticated ways of dealing with the financing. The second bit, which is, I think Usman has elaborated, and you have touched it a little bit more, is, no matter what you do in the system and you fix the plumbing, if the money flows in and then cannot be absorbed, then you have a problem. So you need to make sure that the institutions are solid. You need to make sure that there's a capacity to absorb that kind of money that will going to come. Because there's tons of money that needs to come. But how are we going to make sure that that money is channeled efficiently to where it should be? That's a different ballgame. And this is where we're working also in the Islamic Development Bank in trying to foster some kind of collaboration. We're pushing also for country-level platforms. We want to work with countries using their own systems. It's challenging sometimes in terms of procurement and so forth, but I think we believe that that's the way to go, and we need to cooperate. We need to partner as a development institution to make sure that that works, and making sure that we beef up the institutions. We try to bring knowledge, we try to bring experiences, and we have a very good tool that we call a reverse linkage. It's a South-South cooperation because we are South-South organization, and we're trying to learn from each other. It's not something that comes from the West, it's something that you lived. Sierra Leone can teach Somalia something. Somalia can teach Morocco something. That's what we're trying to do and make sure that we build institutions. Thank you.
I was smiling as you were speaking because it was all music to my ears. And I keep saying this. In fact, one of the reasons that I left the DFI space and came to work at a think tank is to try to advance the very ideas that you're saying. And I loved what you said about loans should not be priced based on risk. What I always say is they shouldn't be priced based on return. They should be priced based on development impact. You should start with the development problem that you're trying to solve. Because at the end of the day, the DFIs, the IFIs, the MDBs, they're development. They're public institutions using public money. And their goal is to advance development, but we've gotten into this place where you've got your pure development institutions that give grants away, and that's okay. And then you've got the financing institutions where their shareholders expect them to be at capital preservation plus a few percentage points. And there's this massive gap between the two, and that's where the blending space comes in and the concessional space comes in. But everyone who works at a public financing institution should be thinking about what their ultimate goal is development. And you should be pricing your deal by looking at all the tools available, grants, financing, technical assistance, to get to where you want from a development standpoint. I think that's what everyone on stage here is aiming to do. So I really appreciated that intervention. Our next panelist is a friend of mine and a former board member, or I should say, one of my former board members when I was at the DFC and currently still on the board of the DFC, Alexia Latortu, who's the Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development at the U.S. Department of Treasury. She has over 20 years of experience in international development and financial system development, including as Managing Director of Corporate Strategy at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and Deputy CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. She's also held senior positions at the World Bank and the Consultative Group to Assist the Poor. And what I can add is she's a person who gets it and cares and wants to figure out how to change the financial architecture. So I am vouching for you, Alexia, here. So not only are fragile and conflict-affected countries amongst the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, they also face considerable barriers to leveraging the financial resources needed to support climate action. How can development funders, DFIs, IFIs, MDBs better support the capacity of fragile countries to access international climate finance at scale?
Thank you so much, my friend, Andy. And let me start by stating the obvious. Addressing fragility, conflict, violence is a global public good with very local impacts, as the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia outlined. Addressing climate change is a global public good with very real local impacts, as the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia outlined. And as the Prime Minister of Chad said yesterday on the opening day of this forum, if we do not tackle these two issues, sustained progress on poverty reduction, on achieving the SDGs, on inclusive, resilient, sustainable growth will not be possible. And so I'm really glad that this session brings together the topics of fragility and climate. And I will focus on your question and try to outline areas of work. Before I do so, I want to share 3 challenges, conundrums that I have, because perhaps you can help me with them when it comes to climate and fragility and the intersection of the two. The first is, clearly, they're intertwined. And yet the communities that work on them, help to provide solutions, support, finance, are often too siloed. Problem number one. Problem number two, in the climate space, we're really focusing hard on scalable solutions for good reasons. In the fragility space, are coming to understand that every single situation of fragility and conflict and violence is unique. And so we need tailored responses. And so how do you put together the need for scale and the need for very, very tailored responses? Conundrum number two. Challenge number three, both need concessionality, significant amounts of concessionality, and yet that is not a resource that is necessarily plentiful. And so what do we do about that? And as the minister from Sierra Leone, I think, suggested, how do we, at the very minimum, use existing sources of finance better, faster? That said, 3 areas of work that the Biden-Harris administration, the Treasury Department is working on. The first one, and I think you would have heard, hopefully, Secretary Yellen talk about this, is she really does believe that the MDBs are not the only piece of the puzzle, absolutely agree with my neighbor, but that they are a critical piece of the puzzle. And not just because of their financing, but because of their expertise, their on-the-ground presence, the policy piece that the VP mentioned as well. But we need to help evolve these MDBs to be better responsive to both the fragility and the climate agendas. And there's a ton of work. I have to say, you have to also, note where progress is. There's been a ton of work that's been done that I'd want to outline. First of all, starting with the World Bank, incorporating both fragility and climate into all of the country engagement model of the institution, expanding the crisis response toolkit of the World Bank, including around climate resilient debt clauses, raising new sources of finance by stretching the balance sheet responsibly and introducing new ways that donors can contribute to the bank through hybrid capital, through guarantee platforms. So these are some examples of progress, but clearly there is much, much more work to do. And I want to outline a couple of areas. We have the replenishment of IDA 21 this year, a huge opportunity to really, again, make sure fragility is at the top of the agenda. We have 1 billion people living in fragility around the world, many of them, but not all of them, in low-income countries, trying to work on the prevention piece of this, which I know is hard, but critical for IDA 21. Also looking at what the whole World Bank group can do more at the sub-national level, because we know in many cases it's not the entire country that's fragile, but there's conflict and violence in very specific spots of a country. Partnering, again, not for partnering sakes, but where we can develop and deliver more impact with the right purposeful partnerships. And then the speed and agility agenda that all the panelists, I think, mentioned. And that's both on the side of the World Bank, but also on the country side. And so where can we streamline processes? Where can we have programmatic approaches that reduce transaction costs? So that's part of the agenda moving forward. On the MDB side, let me leave you with one message, which is that doing core development work better, faster, more effectively is being responsive to the climate agenda. We know that countries in fragility, in situations of fragility and conflict, are more dependent on agriculture, for example, on rain-fed agriculture. And so if we can do better work on agriculture, that is relevant to this agenda. The work that the bank does on social safety nets, social protection can be the matter of life and death. And so that work is important. The work on corruption and institutional strengthening is part of the agenda. I'm looking at the former Prime Minister of Guinea, who yesterday defined fragility as the lack of ability to deliver basic services to people. That's part of the core development work that is responsive to both the fragility and climate agenda. The second big area of work for Treasury is very much linked to a comment the Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia said, which is, we need efficient, targeted financial incentives for countries to do the right thing, to make the investments, particularly on issues that have cross-border relevance. And yet, it is sometimes excruciatingly difficult, complex, slow to access the existing pools of concessional finance. He mentioned the visit of the Global Environmental Facility to Somalia. We are working with the Brazilian G20 presidency on a review of the climate finance architecture to be able to streamline processes, harmonize processes to improve the ease of access to existing funding that's available. The US also pushed very hard in the context of the strategic plan of the Green Climate Fund to make sure that a floor of 50% of adaptation financing, you've talked about adaptation, Andy, is prioritized for the most vulnerable countries. And we're working with all the other funds to have similar targets. Food. Maktar Diop said yesterday, a hungry mob is an angry mob. How can you have social cohesion with hunger? So that's another area of priority for the Treasury Department, both through the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, where about half of the programming of that program has gone to fragile countries, but also through the International Fund in Agriculture, IFAD, through IFAD based in Rome, that just had a replenishment. The US was happy to be the most important funder to that replenishment, where there are targets both on fragility and climate. Let me end with the third area of work, which I think may actually be the hardest one, which is the issue of government capacity and institutional capacity. We are in the opposite situation of a virtuous cycle. Donors are scared, don't want to commit to long-term financing in vulnerable countries that are fragile and that are the most vulnerable to climate. It's easier to do the short-term humanitarian work. And yet, if the long-term investments to building the institutional capacity of these countries are not made, we will never progress. You talked about the plumbing, my neighbor. My view is at the end of the day, all of us will be tested on whether we fix the plumbing so that it's good enough for countries that are affected by violence, by fragility, by conflict, and are facing vulnerability to climate change as well. That will be the test. Let me end with a word to those of you in the room who are staff, management, consultants, interns at the World Bank or other multilateral development institutions. If you make the choice to work in a context affected by violence, by conflict, I thank you so much. I know that it requires particularly strong technical expertise. It requires extra energy. It requires particular savviness. And it requires a good dose of innovation and pragmatism. All qualities that I believe should get you promoted. Thank you.
That's why she's my friend. So you had me at amen after your first point, so that was fantastic. I'm not even going to comment on it. We are running a little bit short on time, but there is. I want to take at least one intervention from the floor, and then we'll wrap up. There was a question that I wanted to direct to Dane McQueen, who is the Director of Programs and Partnerships for the COP28 presidency. Dane, the launch of the Relief, Recovery, and Peace Declaration at COP28 was a landmark occasion, helping raise the profile of the need to scale climate finance in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Reflecting on the discussions today, what do you see as the priorities for effectively implementing the declaration and ensuring that the topic resonates high on the policy agenda going forward?
Thank you very much, and it's been great to hear the points made by the panel and this, I would say, snowball effect that we're seeing on this issue of climate and fragility. So we had I don't want to drink our own Kool-Aid too much, but a really, really good moment at COP28. Had 82 countries and 44 organizations endorse this declaration, providing, I would say, more than a toehold of political recognition. It'd be really hard to walk back from this as a legitimate climate issue in the COP context. And then the other part that was really I think refreshing was the kind of myth-busting part where we surfaced so many good activities happening on food security, on women, peace and security, on anticipatory action, and really proving that actually you can do very effective projects and challenges that are perceived as too risky by most people. So there's that, kind of challenge to the idea that this is an impossible work environment. For this year, I think what we've heard most strongly from the countries, the FCV classified countries, is that they want to see the money. They want to see more disbursement. And there's a couple of different mechanisms that have been identified for that. Within the COP world, obviously the Loss and Damage Fund is one that people want to address this thorny issue about what do you do about countries that may not have the capacity to apply for funding or that are deemed as not having absorption capacity. What are those solutions that have to be worked on? Obviously, there's the GCF strategy piece. There's a question about this new finance goal that will be adopted in COP29. Where does FCV fit into that mix? And then there's also, I would say, kind of nuts and bolts reforms that people are looking at. So if you're an MDB, what's your procurement policy? Are you willing to accept maybe just one supplier instead of 3 in a market because there isn't anyone else? Or if you're not getting money out the door, are you then willing to send up an alarm and say, okay, now we're going to provide more staffing for the national government and invest in the capacity so they can absorb? So there's some very concrete things that came up as tasks this year. And as the UAE, and given the importance of this issue for us in our region, we will be leaning into it for another year. At COP28, we agreed with our partners to have a series of workshops in the first half of the year, including here at the Fragility Forum. We'll have a kind of political preview moment at the UN General Assembly, where countries can come and entities can come forward with some of the ideas that they're working on, and then our hopefully kind of big announcements at COP29 echoing last year. So really looking forward to another year of partnership and getting more and more granular and maybe uncomfortable but inspiring on the details. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Before we take the next question, I'm gonna live up to what I said. I'm gonna offer our other panelists to comment or offer additional comments. And Salah, you mentioned you had a point you'd like to make.
Well, I was thinking of a little bit rocking the boat, but maybe I will not do it in an extreme way. I really want to thank the ideas expressed by Alexia. We last met in Nairobi in the African Climate Summit, and I think it is the efforts that donors and our partners put into institutions like Green Climate Fund and others that make them work closely with us, hopefully in the near future. I want to take note of the fact that you said doing core development work is responding to climate change. I just want to build on that and say, challenge the dogma of lack of capacity. Increasingly, wherever we go, the issue of lack of capacity is becoming the major impediment to unlocking climate finance. I believe that is extremely overrated, I would say for lack of a better word, obstacle. There is no shortage of human capacity, forget about anywhere else in this room, to come up with solutions that would address lack of water. Let's not create a larger than life unimaginable animal. Climate finance is not rocket science. Maybe climate change is rocket science. But responding to it does not require us to bring unheard of expertise to places like Somalia. Water catchments, water wells, water dams, can be easily done, outsourced by private sector, by anybody. But to say we are unable to respond to water needs, and we're spending $11 billion in humanitarian aid, and not focus on preventive and resilience programming, is disservice to the people whose lives are at risk, and disservice to the donors and the taxpayers. When OCHA and FAO see a risk of famine, they have the capacity to bring all kind of expertise. Why not bring all kind of expertise into finding a permanent solution? And maybe we can give them a break. That's one of my quick observations. Finally, I'm not willing to buy the idea that it is because of lack of capacity per se at technical level. It's lack of political will, and it's lack of ill-defined partnerships. We don't take pride, as the Prime Minister of Chad said, in becoming here every time and saying we are attending the Fragility Forum. We have a shot at getting out of this fragility, and we need partners to fire that shot with us. So thank you.
I think this is my favorite panel that I've ever been on. So this has been a great group of people. Take another question from the floor. And please identify yourself.
I feel like we could wrap up after that, but I hope I can ask my question now. I'm Christine Lindell from World Vision. So first, thanks to all the esteemed panelists for their time so far. I wanted to ask about an application of climate finance that I haven't heard mentioned yet, and that's climate finance for climate security work. Climate security is the idea climate change is worsening existing conflicts. So work on that problem could be things like restoring scarce resources like water, renegotiating use agreements between competing groups, strengthening conflict mitigation architecture. Considering fragile contexts struggle quite a bit with both climate change and conflict, as we've been discussing, is climate finance for climate security something that would be viewed as relevant, as welcome by especially our panel representatives coming from national governments? And are there unique barriers to climate finance for this particular use beyond the barriers we've already identified for climate finance for fragile contexts? Thank you.
Does anyone want to take that question? Volunteers? Bill? Okay, well, why don't we take another question and we can think about it if anybody wants to respond to that. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for a great panel. And my name is Peter van Sluis. I'm the coordinator of the Civil Society Platform for Peace Building and State Building. We partner with the G7 Plus and donor agencies working on fragility, conflict and violence in the international dialogue. I want to talk about the issue of partnership and how to follow up on the declaration. There was an intervention made by a representative from the UAE presidency. I think it's a very welcome declaration, but the question is, okay, how do we translate this now into concrete action? How can we work together in partnership? I mean, some of the panelists spoke about the importance of partnership. Also for the predictability and indeed the speed in delivery on the promises made in that declaration. As civil society, we will be tracking the declaration and also the endorsements and the commitments made in that declaration, but also want to put forward ourselves as potential partners, especially at a local level where we think that inputs from local civil society in the design phase of response is crucial. And I miss the connotation of civil society actors and stakeholders at the local level in actually designing but also implementing mitigation and adaptation activities at the local level in response to a changing context and in responding to emergent threats that they see happening at the local level. Would like to see the reflection of the panel on that. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone in particular?
Well, I don't know whether you wanted me in particular, we're together in this, but I just wanted to also use this opportunity, because I did mention partnerships, and I will elaborate a little bit, but I also just wanted to use this opportunity to ask a question as well of the panelists.
Go for it. Take your privilege.
Yes.
You're on the panel.
There is a partnership, as you mentioned, we're your clients. And you're our bankers, and hopefully we're on an equal footing in terms of partnerships. But there's a particular area, and I will not go into, I did want to talk about, well, you spoke of lack of capacity to implement. I think what came out also was a lack of capacity to access these funds. And so we need partnerships in that area, very strong partnerships. Then there was another area that was mentioned, the development of bankable projects. And it is something that we're actually grappling with in our ministry, that we want to have large-scale projects, but it costs so much to develop bankable projects. We have an amount of funds that is not even enough to develop a quarter of a bankable project. So we need partnership also in that area. In terms of the platforms that I mentioned in Sierra Leone, our partnerships actually do go down to the community level. We have the DPAC now has been now cascaded down to district level and pilot chiefdom levels, for which we actually do have support from the World Bank for this. So we do have partnerships, we have donors, we have civil society at the district level and also at the chiefdom level in pilot areas. And it is, the partnerships grow stronger and stronger. We have lead organizations at the district level, and we're also thinking, because we're reviewing these partnerships, and what we find out, well, probably from the central level, is that we're supposed to have sub-working groups. And what is happening in these partnerships is that it seems that the donors are taking the lead in this, and we're seeing this as an anomaly. So we're working towards having joint partnership, both with the donors and the government ministry in the sector. So there are ways that we can strengthen partnerships. There are ways that we are looking at how to strengthen. There are also innovative approaches that we are adopting. And we invite you to Sierra Leone to see some of these.
Thanks so much. So we're 10 minutes over already, and so I'm going to wrap us up. But if any of the panelists had a burning point that you wanted to make, I would invite you to do that. Otherwise, I'm happy to wrap us up and keep us going. Everyone? Okay, great. So I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to take your question. So look, I hope everyone took copious amounts of notes here, because I did, and I'm a terrible note taker normally. This has been one of the most informative panels that I've ever been on, with people sharing specific and actionable items. So I just want to thank you all. A couple of points just to quickly summarize. What I heard from Sala is that we need more adaptation financing from Kenya. Support for government-led platforms. There's too much fragmentation of aid, and we need to harmonize procedures for accessing climate finance. From Usman, the lack of capacity to build strong bankable portfolio, and that we need to expedite processes on government side. From Issa, we need to fix the plumbing. Money needs to flow from where it is abundant to where it is scarce, and we need affordable money. Loans should not be priced based on risk. And from Alexia, there was so much there. I only wrote a few down. Addressing climate change is a global good with very local impacts. Every situation is unique and needs tailored action. You need a significant amount of concessionality, but it's also a finite resource. And MDBs are only pieces of the puzzle, but an important piece in the leadership role that they play. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the bank for hosting. Thank you to Mauricio Vasquez from ODI and the others who helped prepare for this panel. I know a lot of work went into it and getting these fantastic panelists. Everyone have a wonderful day.